Hi folks, I just had a bit of a message for a guy named Barn Blade. He seems to think he knows Scottish history better than me, so I'm going to give you a brief outline of what actually happened between Scotland and England. You know what I mean? Because I feel that when you have people having a discussion like this, you have to hear what actually happened in history instead of hearing two people's opinions. So I'm going to read you a bit from the Act of Union, 1707 Act of Union, the Alba Act of Union. So I hope you bear with me. I want folk to know this. It's very important for me, you know. But anyway, here goes. If you're still thinking what has something which happened centuries after the death of Sir William Wallace got to do with the truth behind the man, you would be right. Of course, it has nothing to do with the man himself, but it does have a lot to do with what Sir William Wallace fought and died for. Scotland's past is stained with the blood of thousands of our people who fought and died to keep Scotland free, none more than Sir William Wallace. Queen Anne, with one stroke of her hand, committed to what Scottish nationalists saw as a supreme betrayal, making the deaths of thousands of Scots fade into history as pointless sacrifice. Relations between the English and the Scots throughout the 1600s had been poor to say the least. During the 1650s, Scots had been subject to Cromwell hostility, continued through the reign of Charles II and James VII. The agreement made with William II in 1689 gave Scotland even greater independence than it had during the times of James VII. The breach was widened even further after the massacre at Glencoe, and by the time Anne came along, Scotland was still fighting against English occupation, a fight which had been ever present since long before Sir William Wallace was born. The making of the United Kingdom had been on the table for decades. It had been proposed in 1606, 1667, 1670 and 1689, and even as far back as Edward's first proposed marriage with his 6-year-old son and 3-year-old Maid of Norway. When she became Queen of Scotland, and each time it was mentioned, fear and racism reared its head, and communication not only ceased but also led to battle. The English argument was, whoever married a beggar could only expect a louse for a portion. In other words, the only benefit in the United Kingdom was in Scotland's favour. The Scots argument was that Scotland would become a region or annex of England, and their more wealthy, more populous and more powerful neighbours would swallow up the nation, just as it had with the Welsh in the 13th century and were still trying to do to Ireland. The first change of attitude came from the English. They found themselves yet again at war with France. King Louis XIV recognised the Catholic James VIII as rightful heir to both the crowns of England and Scotland. Highlands in particular also recognised this claim in Scotland's crown, and many in England, Ireland and Scotland sympathised and supported the Jacobite cause. It is regarded by historians of the time and of now that should the Jacobites, namely James the VIII, son of the exiled James VII, have landed in Scotland to restore the exiled House of Stuart claim in 1702 instead of later, he, James VIII, may well have been accepted instead of Anne, and the whole history of Scotland and the situation now would have been completely different. As it was, the 14-year-old pretender, blessed with a hopeless sense of timing, as his father did nothing. Anne had been imposed on the Scots by the English, and the 1707 Act of Union was inevitable. Child of this forced marriage, therefore Jacobitism became intertwined with Scottish nationalism. Some complications followed which we won't get into to save space on this page. Regarding that, what might have happened should Anne fail to produce an heir, her failure to produce children who lived for any great length of time drew attention to this concern. Scotland wished to pass the Act of Security 1702, which would allow Scottish Parliament to choose an heir should Anne have no successor. This would mean Scotland could possibly name a Scot and once more have an independent monarchy. England's greatest fear was not so much an independent Scotland, but more that the old alliance between Scotland and France, something which had been around since before Wallace's time and came to an end on the death of Alexander III, could be rekindled. Should the throne pass to someone like James Stuart, and the Act of Security would make this a likely scenario. The threat of Jacobite invasion and civil war at the time when England was vulnerable due to the War of Spanish Succession, which they were also fighting, was something which, as far as the English were concerned, must never ever happen. England relied on having Scottish soldiers in its front line against the Spanish, and having them suddenly turn and join ranks with the French would easily turn the balance of power against them. Indeed, there was a Spanish Jacobite rebellion in later years which was aborted. Anne was Scotland's queen, and when she failed to sign the Act of Security, Parliament withheld supplies until she gave in and signed. Within 2 years, 1704, of signing, Scotland was forging its way ahead politically to become a free nation with complete independence from England, whilst maintaining business and commercial ties. Meanwhile, Anne and her English government were still trying to bind the two nations together as one. Scotland held the upper hand at this point and failed to take it. The usual internal disputes between Scotland allowed the English to rethink its plans and force the Alien Act of February 1705. This forced the Scots into a decision that by Christmas Day they had to choose the House of Hanover, who the English wanted to succeed Anne, or renegotiate the Union policy. If they failed to choose either, then England would treat all Scots as aliens, all trade would be destroyed, and any claims of land that Scots held within England would be reclaimed. If this were to happen, it would prove disastrous in Scotland's commerce. There was no way that the rejuvenated connections with France were of more value than English business. At the time, England made her money freely available to Scottish MPs if they supported the Union. In the words of Robert Burns, when reflecting on Scotland's countrymen, they were bought and sold for English gold. In a poorly attended Scottish Parliament, a vote was taken to agree on the commissioners who would discuss and negotiate the Union proposal. By April 1706, discussions between and by July were finalised. With little complication, the terms of union were published and were greeted with roars of distrust and protest. By then it was too late. On January 16, 1707, Scotland had in effect voted itself out of existence by accepting the English ultimatum. Queen Anne herself and the money. The Scottish Parliament was dissolved by the last Scottish monarch on the 28th of April 1707 by the terms of the Act of Union England, and Scotland became in sense one country and became the first Queen of Great Britain, with the succession going over to the House of Hanover on her death. Exactly what the English wanted. There was a full economic union, and the Scots were granted 45 seats in the House of Commons and 16 peers in the Upper House. This was not a fair reflection of the population difference between the two countries or on the contribution toward the now combined revenue. There was a compensation of £398,085 and 10 shillings English value for agreeing to share responsibility of England's national debt. The money was intended to compensate those who had lost out due to the Act, but it was little more than a bribe paid. Why did Scotland accept such a heavy bias deal when it was fighting so hard for independence for years? What was the speculative national bribe of considerable but short-term value? Personal guarantee to those in power, more bribes, the threat of loss of trade and business, and add to that the fact that it did bring political stability to a divided Highland versus Lowland country. It was a situation where they had everything to lose and little to gain. The English had shown tactics which they had used in the battlefield many times. Divide and conquer. The churches and laws of Scotland would not be touched by the Act, and this was one favour with the religious sections within Scotland. At least they would be safe. The English gained in strength in the European arena, and success in battle throughout made Great Britain, under English majority decision in Parliament, indeed a Great Britain. Once the Union was signed, there was no way out, and indeed in 1713 the issue of separate nations was raised, and when put